Okay, I've started recording.
Perfect. Thank you very much. A warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining our today's call on advancing climate and water resilience in the mining sector here at the World Water Week in Stockholm. Unfortunately, we're not in Stockholm. I'm based in Berlin. So warm welcome from my side. My name is Tobias Kind-Rieper. I'm the global lead on mining and metals within WWF. I give a short introduction and then we keep going with our today's session. We as WWF been working in the mining work in general than more than 2 decades. Obviously, it's a big issue for us, and a lot of impacts have been happening on different kind of ecosystem systems, such as water, such as forest, such as soil. But it's also important, the mining sector, obviously, for our transition to energy systems and to green economy, to civilization, and to other parts such as economy. So we are aware of the positive effects by the mining sector itself as well. And I'm really happy to have this conversation today with you all. I'm happy to introduce you to all the 3 speakers today, as the 3 speakers will be in the line as I'm introducing to you. First, we have Alexis Morgan, who is the Water Stewardship Lead at WWF. Secondly, Ariane Laporte-Bisky, who is the Project Manager Water Risk Filter at WWF. And Lucas Gilsbach, who is the researcher at BGR. BGR is an Institute for Geoscience and Natural Resources in Germany, the Federal Institute.
Hello.
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 Hello. I just wait. Sorry, I have to mute everyone. This is actually perfect because this is the next part. I'd like to mute everyone if that's possible. And if you have any questions, please write that in the chat room, as well as just raising your hand. There's a raising hand button on the right side in the chat room, so I can actually facilitate and give you the floor when necessary. And if possible, please write in the chat, so that's easier for me to connect you with the right people. And another part, we will have the session recorded, so if there's any issue, please let us know, and we will stop the recording, obviously. And in the chat part, there is an poll which we put up, done by Lucas Gilsbach, which is really important questionnaires for our work in the water risk filter. So I'd be really happy if you have the time to get into. But now the floor is open, and Alexis, you happy to start the session? Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Tobias. If you can just advance. So to kick things off, I will be discussing a little bit of work that we have been doing over the course of the past year, looking in particular at global water risks and the mining sector. And there's a piece of analysis that we did several months ago at this point, but I wanted to walk people through it because it has strong applicability to the question that we're discussing today. So next slide, please. So this report that we built out, it was based on analysis from last year. We published it early this year in February of this year. And what we were seeking to do was really draw from WWF's tool, the Water Risk Filter, which is a global, freely accessible water risk analysis and response sort of website. And Ariane will be speaking a little bit more about that in a moment. And we combined that with the S&P mining database to really dig into the status of water risk on a global basis for all global active operational mines. And really the aim behind this work was really to get a better sense of what was going on, not only in terms of risk exposure of commodities, but understanding what it looked like for countries and beginning to move down this pathway to look at what it looked like for companies as well. And that had linkages onto some of the environmental, social, and governance, or ESG kind of evaluation that investors were beginning to ask of us and others. So next slide. So in terms of this work, I mentioned we were looking at kind of active operational mines. This gives you a kind of a snapshot of what that looks like on a global basis. What that worked out to was a little over 3,000 mines that we were looking at. And as you can see from some of the sidebar pieces on that, I know that the text is maybe a little bit small, but out of that little over 3,000 mine count, the majority, I guess not necessarily majority, but the largest block was coming from coal mines, followed by gold, silver, and so forth. So it gives you a sense of the percentages broken out by primary metals for those different respective mines. So there were a series of commodities that emerged out of that were the sort of primary focus for the mines that were listed in that. Next slide. And so what did we learn out of all of this? There's a ton of information, and I would encourage people to access this report. If you Google those kind of keywords that we've already talked about, you'll no doubt find it. But what we found as we went through this is we looked in particular, to begin with, at the different commodities. We definitely found that there were certain commodities that sort of were more exposed, and the risks really look quite different depending upon which commodity you're looking at. And a big part of that really comes down to the fact that, you know, mining ultimately is quite a clustered component, and water is a very local issue. So certain geographies and the underlying geology behind that tends to lead towards, you know, situations that are more prone to flooding, drought, those different kind of issues. However, we also looked across them and did determine that there were some commodities, in particular, some of the ones that sort of came out of this, things like coal, did have quite high levels of risk across a number of different areas, whereas other ones were that much lower. And so this gives you a bit of a picture that you can kind of look at things. We did look at, as I mentioned, there's 32 different indicators within the risk filter that are looked at, and those get broken into 3 broad categories: physical water risk, regulatory water risk, and reputational water risk. So you see those categories over on the right-hand side and on the table there. And again, it sort of shows you how they differ by different categories as well. So it gives you a bit of a sense of where some of those results came out. I'll dig into this a little bit further on the following slide. So if you can go to the next one. As I mentioned, this kind of clustering became a fairly important key takeaway. And you can see some of these different clusters. I mean, and this becomes quite relevant from a water perspective for several different reasons. One is that the water risks that affect the mines that are in these regions tend to be somewhat similar, not always identical, because the clustering and the water risks are much more granular than these broad circles that you're seeing on here. But you do see clusters not only of certain commodity types. So for example, the kind of black dots on here represent coal mines. The kind of teal colored ones in Chile and so forth represent copper. And you can see some of the kind of yellow ones that are in West Africa that are gold related. So you can see these kind of clusters of certain commodities. But within those, again, a lot of the water risks that are being faced in those clustered areas tend to be quite similar, which also begins to kind of move us towards one of the other pieces that to get at resilience for mining, you need to start thinking out the sort of more landscape level, and the risks that people face tend to be somewhat similar. So collaborating on common kind of risk forms becomes quite critical for the mining sector in these different areas. Next slide. So a few kind of key takeaways on here. One was that coal really was, you know, broadly speaking, the most exposed commodity. There was chromite as well, but coal is a much bigger grouping. And I guess one of the things for us is that this really puts a fair bit of pressure on the coal sector, whether it's thermal or metallurgical. Certainly on the thermal side with the carbon transition risk components, it really is pushing that sector and the mining associated with that. That's also being exacerbated now due to not only existing water risks, but future climate impacts. And so in particular, coal mining companies are going to need to really think about really strong resilience strategies on this. This clustering is something that, you know, we definitely noticed. And as I mentioned already, it has links to water risk and response. And I guess the third kind of key takeaway was that while scarcity really typically dominates a lot of this, there really needs to be a lot more attention paid to flooding, quality, and reputational risks, as these risks really came up quite strongly within the commodities that we were looking at. Next slide. So another thing to, I guess, look at is traditionally when we're looking at water risk and thinking of it through this lens of resilience as well, we tend to look at what a site is or a mine is exposed to in terms of basin risk. We look at the nature of the mine itself in terms of what its operational water requirements are. And then we also look at this third issue around how is the mine or the company and the site beginning to mitigate the water risks. And it's the combination of that exposure and the mitigation that ultimately leads to the impact occurring and then the financial consequences that come from that. So it does allow us to begin to look at this issue as it plays out for mining companies. So if you click again, please. What we did in this analysis was largely look at the basin water risk exposure. And we were able to do that looking at different companies, and we can aggregate the mines, the operational mines at least, within these different companies. And it allows for us to really get a sense of what does that risk exposure and picture look like across different major companies. And we can also look at smaller companies as well. But this gives you a sense of, for some of the largest players like BHP, Rio Tinto, Glencore, and so forth, what does that picture look like in terms of overall water risks? And is it physical, regulatory, reputational? What are the issues in play for these different mining companies? Click again. And so, as I mentioned, this focus on the basin water risk, but if you click once more, what we didn't look at as much in this analysis, but we have the potential to look at are these secondary pieces on operational water risk and response. And we feel that those are actually quite critical in understanding really what the picture is. Oftentimes, a lot of the analysis that's out there does only look at this exposure issue, and it leaves a lot off of the table. And so it is really quite important to look at the nature of the mine and how it's using water, and then secondly, what are the responses that are in place to be able to have a really comprehensive picture about how well prepared are these mining companies to face not only existing water risks, but future potential stresses that are likely to come under different climate scenarios. Next slide. So a few kind of key things here in terms of broader takeaways. We do feel like these sorts of tools like the risk filter and combining these with these new asset level data sets like the S&P data set do enable a really quite a comprehensive understanding of what water risk exposure or basin water risk exposure looks like. What it is going to require as it goes forward is the extension of this into different scenarios and financial modeling as we begin to think about how this links into resilience. There are certainly tools that are moving in that space, and Ariane will be speaking a little bit more about that. And similarly, Lucas will be speaking a little bit more about some of the pieces on operational data and gathering more comprehensive operational data. And so it's important in the second point here to really think of water risk and thinking about resilience as a function of basin exposure, operations, and response. And so all of those different pieces are quite critical, and you need to understand those to really inform not only corporate response at the mine site or at the corporate level, but also from an investor perspective as well. So this is a relevant kind of takeaway for both companies and shareholders. And the last thing is that we've really only just scratched the surface of this database. It's got a ton of information, and we feel like there's a lot more that we could learn. So if there are those of you who are on the call who are really interested in digging into a little bit more of this, you can certainly feel free to reach out on the back of this call. Next slide. And I believe that was the kind of last general pieces that I wanted to hit upon. We're happy to answer questions in the Q&A or pick up on these other things. But from here, you'll hear now from Ariane on the risk filter and some of the new pieces that are being developed there to help support the mining sector, as well as some pieces from Lucas on how we're thinking about additional operational information. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Can you just confirm you can hear me? Correct. Yes. Okay. Excellent.
Confirmed.
So thank you. Thank you and good day, everyone. So I'm Ariane. I'm the project manager for WWFs Water Risk Filter tool. And yeah, as you've seen actually from the analysis and key findings shown in Alexa's presentation, the water risk filter tool is really, it's a powerful tool to perform a comprehensive assessment and understanding of water risk at a global scale. And in my presentation, I'll be giving you an overview in more details of the tool itself, how it works, and how its different functionalities can be used and applied in the context of the mining sector. Now, for those of you who are not so familiar with the tool, as Alexis mentioned, it's basically a free, practical online tool that was developed for both companies and investors to use and help them assess, respond, and value their water risk, whether it's in their operations, their supply chain, or their investments. And it can be used and applied for all industries, including, of course, in this case, for the mining sector. Could you move to the next slide, please? Now, since its creation and launch of its first version, which was back in 2012, the Water Risk Filter tool is really the only tool out there to help assess both basin and operational water risk, which were mentioned by Alexis, and therefore really be able to provide a comprehensive assessment of water risk exposure, covering all three risk types. If you can click again, which are all three risk types: the physical, regulatory, and reputational risks. Now, just so that you understand what do you need to do, how can you actually conduct a basin and operational risk assessment? Well, in terms of data input, to assess basin risk using the water risk filter tool, all you need to provide is the geolocation information of where your mine sites are located. And so the tool will then automatically map and assess the basin risk of your portfolio of mine sites. And from there, you can already start to identify your water risk hotspots. But however, risk exposure, as you've heard, also depends on how a mining site uses and manages water for its activities, which we refer to as the operational risk. And by entering your site operational data within a questionnaire, the tool can also automatically assess operational risk, and then you can start to combine both basin and operational risk information for a really deeper understanding of overall risk exposure in terms of physical, regulatory, and reputational risk. Now, whilst the operational risk questionnaire, which is currently available in the tool, it's a standard generic questionnaire that can be applied for all industries. You will be hearing in the next presentation by Lucas about the work in progress on the development of a more sector-specific water risk filter operational questionnaire tailored for the mining sector, which is very exciting. But in my presentation, if you move on to the next slide, I'll give you a bit more of a little deep dive into the basin risk assessment framework used for the tool to give you a bit of background. So each of the risk types, the physical, regulatory, and reputational risks, are comprised of different risk categories in the water filter framework and structure to ensure a more complete coverage of issues. And so, for example, if we take physical water risk, it's comprised not only of water scarcity, which, as you've heard from Alexis, tends to have a lot of focus, but also the tool covers the other physical risks, such as flooding, quality, and ecosystem service status, which, as you've heard from our analysis, actually showed are of a high importance for the mining sector to also pay attention to in terms of physical risks. Now, all these different, risk categories here that are listed are informed by a diversity of data sets to account for the multiple dimensions and nuances when it comes to water. And more specifically, we use a total of 32 most up-to-date and peer-reviewed data sets, which we update on an annual basis, by the way. And this year's data update, just so that you're aware, is being planned for around November time this year. And if you can click again, please. With the water risk filter tool, then you can map and assess all mine sites across the world using the tool's 32 global water risk layers, and as you illustrated by the research analysis which was presented. But in addition to the global risk assessment, if you can click again, the water risk filter also has and includes high resolution local data sets, which I'd like to flag to you, for at the moment a total of 13 countries and regions available online at the moment, and we're expanding it even more as in the future. We're currently working on new data sets for Europe and also India, for example. But for both global and this local risk basin risk assessment, the tool's risk framework and structure remains the same, but where possible for the local assessment, it tries to draw on the best available local data sets to offer a finer scale assessment of all all, risk for mining sites in the specific region or country of interest. And so, for example, on this slide, you can see an example of assessment for mining sites located in South Africa using our local water risk filter high-resolution data sets for South Africa. Next slide, please. So that's for the risk part, but as you've also heard, so water risk exposure is really only half of the story. It's important to consider response as well and be prepared to face the water risk, current as well as future. And the water risk filter really now goes beyond being a traditional risk assessment tool to now by dynamically linking your water risk assessment results to providing a customized list of response action to help you address your identified basin and operational water risk. And so, yeah, in the tool, you can actually filter the recommended actions according to different criteria. Some examples on the right-hand side. So you could filter actions that you want to know about implemented at the mine site or at the corporate level, for example, or filter actions according to different SDG 6 on water. But really, the idea is that this water risk filter response section was developed based on WWF's expertise to help guide companies from understanding water risk towards identifying and implementing contextual response actions, which is really critical. And these actions have been they've been developed and they're recommended that they're aligned with water stewardship initiatives such as the Alliance for Water Stewardship, the CO1 mandate, and SDGs. And we're exploring ways of looking at also including more sector-specific actions in the future for the mining sector, for example, which would have to be aligned obviously with key standards initiatives in the mining sector, which you'll hear about some of them in the next presentation. Could you skip to the next slide, please? But to help focus response efforts to address most critical business risk, it's important to understand what are the most material water risk for the mining sector. And at last year's water and mining event in Canada, these graphics were presented to illustrate actually the different potential impacts from water risk for companies in the mining sector based on CDP's water security data reported by mining companies from 2014 to 2017. And these findings, the idea is that the key point is that these findings show that a majority of the mining companies reported exposure to physical water scarcity risk, which could result, as you see on the right-hand side, to a whole bunch of different types of impacts, whether it's from production disruption to higher operating cost and etc. But as you can see on the left-hand side column, water scarcity is only one risk representing over 30% of reported risk, and there are a whole bunch of other water risk related to regulatory, but also physical risk, flooding, which are critical and should not be underestimated and overlooked by the mining sector, as these can lead to a whole bunch of different financial and significant impacts for a mining company. If you could click on the next slide, please. Which, as you can see here, is a list of reported impacts from regulatory risk with a range, ranging from high operating costs to delayed permitting or loss of license to operate, for example. Next slide, please. Now, in collaboration, and so as a result, in collaboration with CDP and Water Foundry, Alexis Morgan has been leading on the development of a new valuation tool called Water and Value. The acronym is WAVE, which will be powered by CDP's water security data to help analyze how water risk may potentially affect financial value. And Alexis is currently organizing some beta testing, so do get in touch if you want to get involved. But the idea is that this new WAVE tool will be embedded and available from the water risk filter tool and downloadable as an offline Excel-based user-guided tool. With the water risk filter tool, really, the WAVE tool is being designed really to leverage the water risk filter tool information on basin and operational risk, as well as the CDP water security data to link water risk to financial impacts, as I've illustrated earlier. But it will also require some user input in order to ultimately evaluate and convert how water risk values can translate into potential financial impacts for a given site. And obviously, I encourage you to read the report on linking water risk and financial value if you want to learn a bit more on the background. If you can skip to the next slide, please. Which is, last but not least, I'm very excited to let you know of a major new feature in the tool, which we are developing, which are climate and socioeconomic pathway-based water scenarios for 2030 and 2050 that will be integrated into the tool and coming live in October this year to enable forward-looking water risk assessment. We are developing these with the aim to support companies to perform scenario analysis as recommended by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, which recommends to apply scenario analysis for assessing climate-related risks and opportunities to determine potential business implications and evaluate business resilience. So do stay tuned for this new feature coming live and the great work, technical work that my colleague Rafael Camargo, who's on this call, the Water Risk Filter technical lead, has been doing. And there's a great opportunity to revisit the analysis that Alexis presented on using the SMP mining database, which with the new water filter scenario to unearth some new insights on how water risk for the mining sector may evolve under potential future scenarios and evaluate resilience when combining information on response and strategy in the mining sector. So to conclude, which is my last slide, the water filter is really just it's a powerful tool. I hope I've convinced you. It's accessible, it's easy to use for conducting a comprehensive water risk assessment, both looking and considering basin and operational risk. I encourage you to read this report on the right tool for the job if you want more general guidance on how to conduct a robust risk assessment. But in particular, the water risk filter tool differentiates itself from other risk tools out there by providing unique functionalities to understand financial risk exposure and financial impacts, and also help identify contextual response to address risk. And now there's this new integration of new water risk filter scenarios coming live on the 7th of October. So do watch out for this new feature, which will be enabling forward-looking risk assessment to help evaluate and strengthen also long-term resilience planning and strategy as recommended by the TCFD. And that's all for me. And so thank you so much. And I'll leave over to Lucas, who will be presenting some very exciting, even more developments to the tool that are ongoing for more tailored sector-specific assessment of water risk for the mining sector. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ariane. Hi, everybody. My name is Lucas. I'm a researcher at the Federal Institute for Geosciences and Natural Resources here in Hanover, Germany. And today I'm going to be talking about the development of a mining-specific operational water risk assessment template for the water risk filter. And I'll start by giving some numbers to illustrate why we should care about water risks at mine sites. And I'll then move on and show how our development relates to a very, very peculiar German animal. And by the end of the talk, I hope you will know how our work can support you in your everyday work then. So let's jump right in. Next slide, please, Tobias. Okay, so why should we care? Mining, on the left-hand side, you can see some data from a very recent CDP report published in 2019. In 2018, 17 companies reported a combined annual water-related impacts of 6 billion. And those impacts mostly related to increasing costs, water-related production disruptions. And to the right, I put two numbers from high-profile companies. They reported in the same year, and you can see their impacts go into the hundreds of millions. And below, the financial implications of the reported risks sum up to 25 billion, and mostly due to anticipated production disruptions and increasing operating expenditure. And to the right, you can see those risks are expected to materialize in the near future with quite a high likelihood. And that actually nicely fits with a report that was published by Fitch and CAU a couple of months ago. They interviewed corporates and investors on their perception on ESG risks in mining. And as you can see, both parties expect climate change to be the main risk driver. And actually 100% of investors expect increasing water availability risks, and 75% of corporates. So making water availability the #1 and #2 ESG risk respectively. Okay, so that sets the scene for our work. And before we get serious, let me tell you a short story about me when this project started. So Tobias, next slide, please. Okay, so we were setting this thing up with our colleagues from WWF. And I was sitting in my office thinking about the way forward. And I was becoming a bit desperate, to be honest, because I was like, how does a tool look like that gives you a basic understanding of mine site water risks that respects current leading industry practice and at the same time is easy enough to use so people will actually apply it. And what didn't make it easier is that this thing in the middle of the white cycle kept popping up in my head, distracting me from my thoughts. So let me introduce you to the eierlegende Wollmilchsau. It's an animal that appeared in the German language somewhere in the 70s. And as you can see, it's a sheep that can lay eggs and give milk before it might eventually turn into a Sunday roast. And we use it actually to refer to somebody or something that is capable of doing a wide variety of things. So I was sitting there with my imaginary friend and then thinking about a solution. And what I want to do on the next 3 slides, I want to address each of these 3 points and thereby highlight some key features of our development and hopefully illustrate how it can be of practical relevance to you. So Tobias, next slide, please. Okay, so how does it help to offer basic understanding of mine-site water risks? Basically, it guides your evaluation based on 23 questions that relate to 23 risk drivers characteristic to the mining industry. And on the left-hand side, you can see an example. Let's focus on the question first. We will go through the descriptor levels later. So as you can see, this question is on life of mine, water treatment requirements. And in the top right box, you can see we have other questions, for example, on mine dewatering, on tailings or a post-closure water treatment. And those factors and the questions are the result of a comprehensive literature analysis. So we went through a wide variety of documents. For example, we considered the performance guidelines from the IFC, and we asked the question, what do they consider to be the most important risk drivers in relation to water and mining? And we then tried to include those in the questionnaire. And as we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, we also took a close look to the ICMM guide on catchment-based water management. They detail an approach and factors to consider when assessing risks in a mining context. And we try to include those factors mentioned in there as far as possible. And so people using the water risk filter can be quite confident that they cover important aspects recommended to consider by ICMM when assessing mine-site water risks. Okay, the purpose here was really to include multiple perspectives in formulating those 23 questions. Okay, next slide, please. We will move now to the risk descriptor levels or the risk levels to show, and I want to show you how we try to include current leading industry practice in mine-site water management. So you see the same example as before on the left-hand side. And you can see that we structured the descriptor levels twofold here. So first, according to the treatment needs, ranging from low treatment needs over basic to significant. And second, to the application of the waste management hierarchy to the treatment products, which are basically water and sludge in this case. And you can see those range from the minimization through to recycling and disposing, discharging them. And what I also want to highlight is a feature common to all 23 questions is that the highest risk is always given in a situation the risk is not understood. And that kind of relates to this saying of you can only manage what you know. And you might be aware that next to the section on assessing risks, the water risk filter features a section on evaluating the water stewardship maturity of a company, and the same accounts for our work. And we formulated a set of questions based on the 4 principles of the ICMM water stewardship framework. So evaluating a company with a water risk filter is somewhat a benchmark against this ICMM industry standard. Okay, so by structuring the descriptor levels and aligning to best practice industry standards, we really try to include leading industry practice into the questionnaire. Next slide, please. Okay, so how did we try to lower the amount of work as far as possible that is needed to use a water risk filter? Basically, we try to create synergies with established water reporting frameworks. In formulating and selecting the 23 questions, our main orientation was the ICMM guide on water reporting. For example, included all 4 reporting metrics that are required when reporting against ICMM in the questionnaire. And on the left-hand side, you can see an example from question number 1, which is on the main operational water activities of a company. And the same information are required when providing a context statement when reporting against ICMM. And the same accounts for CDP, for example. They require metals and mining companies to disclose the number of active and inactive tailing storage facilities and their control, and that reappears in the questionnaire then. So the purpose here was really to make information that are available from standard industry reporting also valuable for using in the water risk filter and vice versa. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, to sum this up, so we tried to develop a tool that respects important risk drivers in the mining industry, that touches on leading practice in mine site water management, and that creates synergies with information that are available from standard industry reporting. And we are currently finishing a draft version. And we would now be really happy to have your contribution. And so I would kindly ask you to fill the survey we published on our program website. We will use these information to calculate weights for the individual risk drivers in the questionnaire. And if you're working for a mining company or mining association and you would be willing to test with us, that would be great. We would be really happy if you drop us a mail. And yeah, I guess that's it from my side. Thanks very much for your time, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Lucas, and thank you, Ariane and Alexis. Also, just to name that Alexis already put the poll in the chat, so you can click on that as well if you immediately want to obviously answer the questions. So thank you all for the great presentation. Now it's up to you, dear participants, to ask questions in the Q&A. If you have any, you could drop that in the chat box, or you can raise your hand button and I can then roll your name and you can start speaking. So if you have any questions, please let us know. We have a bit of time, so don't worry. So if there are no questions yet, perhaps Ariane, Alexis, or Lucas, if you have something you push through and you want to give a focus on another minute, because we have 8 minutes left, and then we'll really be happy to use the kind of minutes. If you have anything else, you shorten up and you'll be happy to get more into that. That's your time as well.
Sure, I will take advantage of the little bit extra time. So a couple of other flags which are a little bit more general to what we're up to is that we will have, in addition to some of the pieces that Ariane mentioned, we are going to be launching a series of other additional guidance documents this fall that speak to resilience and kind of building resilience and scenarios. And so stay tuned, I would say, in addition to some of the mining specifics and sectoral work that we're developing in conjunction with BGR and some of the pieces that we have done, there are some pieces that we'll be building out as well, just in terms of helping to provide guidance to companies and to mine sites and well, any sites out there on ways to kind of embed resilience into operations and really thinking about that. So there's a bunch more materials coming on that as well to stay tuned for.
Perfect. Thanks, Alexis. And in general, I wanted to add as well that you are more than welcome to drop us a mail of anything which could be related to your work. We're happy to engage with you, and we do that already. So we're really glad if that's an issue. If you have any kind of questions, just let us know, and we're happy to have a bilateral call with you or your company or your association or your entity in general. So if there's no questions, I'll give you another minute, and there's a question or there's a remark. perhaps Francisco wrote the question, so I'll pop it up. In the time that you have used this tool, have found any relation between the mining water risk and the type of mine that are analyzing? Perhaps this is a part, Alexis, you can get into because it's report related.
Yeah, so there is definitely some level of relationship between mine types and the forms of mining water risk. It tends to, I mean, the S&P data set does have information, depends on what exactly you're unpacking on mine type, but it does have additional information in terms of whether it's an open pit and a few other kind of forms of mining. It is worth noting that the data set also doesn't get into, you know, artisanal mining and those sorts of things, because it is, you know, we were dealing with operational large mines. But yeah, there is certainly some levels of relationships that we're seeing on that. That said, as I mentioned in my presentation, I would say we've only just scratched the surface of this. The data set itself is hefty, shall we call it, and we've subsetted it down. So I mean, it's a giant pivot table which allows us to unpack and unpick a zillion different things, and we've only really started to kind of scratch the surface of it. So my suspicion is that there are probably all sorts of quite fascinating relationships built into there, and I think as we get additional information, and we did consider drawing from additional CDP data to try to get at some additional information in terms of operational side and response side, because CDP does gather some of that, but not all of the major mining companies respond to CDP. So it's a partial data set that we would have on that. But it's, yeah, we've got some pictures of some of that, and there's a lot more to be unpacked potentially. So we could probably do a second and third report if we want to. We're just a little bit capacity constrained because we've got all sorts of other things going on. So we do look to others that are interested in this space to help us, and that's really what prompted some of the engagements that we've had with Lucas as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Alexis. All right. So, Alexis, you want to say something? Go on.
No, just a thank you to everybody for your time. And Tobias, before you wrap, you may want to also mention in terms of where our work is maybe starting to go forward on the mining side more broadly as well, just to flag some of the stuff that you've got that's under development as well.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Alexis. So as Alexis mentioned before, we do have obviously, and this is probably going into the question you raised, Francisco, a lot of other issues regarding mining in general. So there's the whole picture about artisanal scale mining. We developed internally a mining strategy within WWF, which will be hopefully being published in a couple of months. And it's going to be a policy position where we actually recommend issues regarding large scale, but also small scale mining in terms of policy and positions on that. And furthermore, we have projects on the ground and future projects which case and work on artisanal and small scale mining to minimize impacts by the mining industry. And this goes into forestry, into soil, and into freshwater. Some of the issues, for example, are at the moment that we look into contamination levels of mercury into freshwater areas in the Amazon regions. And beside that, there are a lot of other issues regarding mining and artisanal scale mining, especially by gold in Myanmar and Southeast Asia. So these are various projects which are popping up and coming more into that. And we'll have hopefully soon reports on actually contamination levels on that. We did already some reports in the Amazon on that, but if we want to make it more broadly, you know, including areas in Asia, in Africa as well. And beside that, we still kind of involve more and more into initiatives and certification systems. We will look into how we can support in the working groups, but also in steering committees and in the boards on work on mining in general, how we can actually, decrease the impact and have a less impact of the mining industry, but on the other side also see the positive effects mining can actually have for livelihood and for civilization and economy effects in the area as well. So there's another last question, and that will be coming from Laura Weintraub, and I think we have 2 minutes left, so I would be eager to raise that question. Have you been able to build connections with companies looking at mining in supply chains, tech sector, electric power, and so on? What opportunities are there? Alexis, you can start with that as well, but I would shortly say, yes, we have been in contact in terms of supply chain with mining companies, especially also with downstream companies regarding their supply chain. And this is something which is our focus on, actually, to talk mostly with downstream companies about their transparency in the supply chain, to know where it comes from, which is a big issue in the metal sector itself, that a lot of companies and downstream companies don't know where it comes from and then can't deal with the risk. Ariane was so kind to tell the 3 risk levels we have. So it's important for us, for the downstream companies, to know where it comes from. And with the mining companies, we've been in talks, as well deeply, and actually not only on freshwater, but to see what kind of issues regarding, for example, protected areas, deforestation-free supply chain is involving, is happening, is possible. So this kind of talks exist. And with the tech company, and this is the last point on my side, and then Alexis, perhaps you can talk on that as well. Is that we've been engaged with tech companies as well. But again, this is really depending on what kind of tech company it is. And if it's an EV car producer, then it really verifies, for example, what kind of battery is involved and so on. So this mostly goes into direct talks with the company itself, because they are very, very different from each other. But this is happening as well. And Lex, perhaps you want to drop off a sentence on that as well, from a water stewardship perspective.
Yeah, very briefly, because time's short. Long story short is, yes, we have, Laura. There has been engagement with the Responsible Business Alliance. Their push has largely been on the smelting side rather than on the all the way back to the mineral extraction side, but there is some stuff that has been engaged there, and we have had conversations in the past. Much of the focus, at least on a water perspective, in the electronics and tech sector has been on production side rather than going back to mine side, but it is something that there is a discussion on. On the electric power generation side as well, tied to mining, again, it's something we've looked at. There was actually another presentation during Water Week this past week where we've been starting to look at hydropower and power production looks like under these different water risk scenarios that Ariane was mentioning as well. And so we are starting to look at that and what the implications might be on, especially for players like the aluminum side, where there's huge hydroelectric use. So yes, we have dug into it. Yes, we have some stuff on it. But again, we're kind of only scratching the surface on a bunch of some of these things right now.
All right, so thank you everyone. To stay tuned, you can follow us on Twitter with the Water Risk Filter and on LinkedIn as well. I think that would make sense, or drop us an email. And again, thank you very much for everyone to join the call and have this discussion. And we're looking forward to get in touch with all of you, and have a nice day, evening, morning, and enjoy the day. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Excellent. Have a lovely day.